So this is a 1966 Corvette Roadster, and this is really my first collector car. This car is very special to me because I bought it when I was 30 years old, and I had saved money for quite a while, and I made a little bit of money in a real estate transaction that allowed me to buy my dream car. I'd kept a little picture of the car in my wallet for years. I knew I wanted a 66 Corvette convertible, and lo and behold, when I had the money and I had the garage space, this car popped up and I was able to buy it. Now at the time, it was 1987, it was really a 20-year-old, just a used car. It was certainly collectible and beautiful, but not to the level that you see it here. It had snow tires on it. It was just a used car. And I drove it quite a bit. I dated my wife in it and had a wonderful time with the car. Eventually, the car needed restoration, and a friend of mine performed a full body-off restoration. Here's what the engine looks like. It's a 327 Chevrolet engine with 350 horsepower. And the most interesting thing about this car occurred when we took the body off. And I want to show you something not many people know about these cars. The Chevrolet produced this book called the Chevrolet Power Manual. Now, I had never heard of this book, but when the body came off the chassis of this car, my restorer said, you know, Jeff, the chassis on this car is different than any other chassis I've seen. It's been stitch welded, seam welded all around, where normally the chassis are stitch welded. There's like two pieces of chassis they put together and they put a little stitch of weld. This car had the welding all the way around it. And so that was a curiosity. And there were a couple of other things he noticed when the interior came out. There were holes in the floor, like maybe a roll bar was there. So I researched it a little bit more and I find out about this Chevrolet Power Manual, and it turns out that Chevrolet, in their good graces, came up with a way, this book, that would allow you to prepare the car for IMSA and SCCA Trans Am Series racing. That was really thoughtful of them, I thought. And here they discuss all of those modifications, stiffening of the chassis, seam welding it, and they're even filling some holes, like there was a hole behind the steering box. And sure enough, here's a picture of that area. That area has been filled in. So at one time, this car was probably road raced. Unfortunately, I don't have the history of it, but it was neat to know that it had lived this very exciting life before I got the car. We made a lot of modifications to the car. This was not a matching number car. It was basically just a street-driven and driven hard car. But some of the modifications we made were specifically to accommodate me, because I'm 6'5", and I didn't never really fit in the car very well. So what we did was we took and removed the seat tracks completely from the car. The seats are just bolted right to the floor. That gave me an extra couple of inches of headroom. And then the other thing we did was we cut the pedals, the brake and clutch pedal, right at the hinge point under the dashboard, and we made tabs and moved the pedals back 2 inches. Then we cut the floor behind the pedals so that we'd have enough room behind that. So now I sit in this car and I'm comfortable as can be, and I'm actually looking right through the middle of the windshield, which was great because for all the years I had the car before that, I was kind of looking at the back of the sun visor. Anyhow, this car, after restoration, it really drives very well. It's a super reliable car and a lot of fun, and we still have a great time with it, and that's why it's right by the door here. It's like the first car that we take out when we want to go for a ride. So a lot of people will say, Jeff, those aren't the original wheels that were on the car. And they'd be right. These are mag wheels. And when I remember Corvettes being driven on the street, nobody kept the original wheels on the car. You're totally uncool if you had the original hubcaps or wheel covers on the car. Everybody, the first thing they did was put mag wheels on, and so that's kind of what I tried to replicate here, was the Corvette in my mind as a young guy in my early teens, what my Corvette would have looked like. The other thing you'll notice, the real Corvette purists will know that Chevrolet never offered a red interior with a silver body in 1966. You could get it in 65, but not in 66. And I loved this color combination. There's something about the red interior really pops. So when we restored the car, we put a red interior in. One more thing I'd like to show you is that I knew the dealer that sold the car. It was a dealer called Boyd Mullen in Texas. That was the original selling dealer. And I looked all over for one of those trunk emblems for it, and because I was so into trunk emblems, as you know, so I couldn't find one, but I was able to have a friend of mine replicate it with his 3D printer, and my wife is very good with graphics, and she was good enough to come up with what a facsimile dealer emblem might have looked like. So it's kind of a little goofy, but that's what the Boyd Mullen dealer emblem might have looked like on the back of this Corvette when it was new. So then the next car I'd like to share with you is this 66 Corvette. What, Jeff, another 66 Corvette? Yes, but this one is a coupe body style, and I love 66 Corvettes, and I really decided I had to have one of each. Now, why I chose this particular car is because after I restored that car, people said to me, you know, Jeff, the restored cars never drive like the original cars. You're really missing out on that. The original cars just drive so much nicer. So I had to find out for myself, and I searched and searched, and I found this car, and this car has 37,000 original miles. It's never been restored. The engine's never been out of the car. And what else makes it unique is the color. This red with a red interior is a very rare color combination. And unlike the silver with red, you could get red with red. So the other thing that's kind of interesting is it also has 350 horsepower, 327 cubic inch engine. It has knockoff wheels, and these are the original knockoff wheels that came with the car. The car had a bunch of paperwork, including the original sales slip. There was the original invoice, the warranty book, the owner's manual, all the stuff that real Corvette guys want to have when they buy a used Corvette. There's nothing like an original car. So to answer the question, does the original car actually drive better than the restored car? I would say yes and no. Here's the yes part. The shifter on this car is buttery smooth. It's just a wonderful, smooth shifting car. The controls for the heating and air conditioning just work so nicely, and the doors close just beautifully. Now, that car, the 66 convertible, it shifts very nice, but not as buttery smooth as this. And I kind of attribute that to the fact that when the cars were built, the assemblers, they had the right fixtures, they had the jigs, they had OEM parts where that car might have had more reproduction parts used on it, and they just fit together better. And so I think that's really what they're getting at when they say, well, the reproduction car, the restored car versus the original car. So the difference is, and why I say a little of this and a little of that, is because the modifications that I made to that car make the car a lot more enjoyable by lowering the seat and moving the pedals back. The other thing that I did was I put Dynamat in the entire interior of the car. Now, Dynamat is a sound deadening material, and I just want to show you the difference here in the doors. If you tap on this door, listen to this. Now, watch when I tap on this door. Much more solid. And that sound deadening quality, even though it's a convertible, gives this car a wonderfully quiet ride. And so that's why each car has its own personality and a little bit of driving differences. I love them both. People say to me, well, which one do you prefer, Jeff? It's the car I'm driving that very day. So by now you've probably figured that I'm a big fan of General Motors styling from the 60s. You know, I love the Corvette, but this Riviera to me was a sensational car, styled really the most beautiful General Motors sedan to date. Bill Mitchell had been involved with the styling, and he had a vision of a Ferrari front with kind of a Rolls-Royce rear of the car, and so I was on the lookout for a Riviera, and this was really my second collector car after the Corvette, and I had mentioned to my wife that, you know, I'm going to try to find a Riviera But don't worry, honey, I'll look for one that doesn't have any rust, because she remembered how painful it was for one of the restorations that I had done with a car that had rust. It took over a year just to eradicate the rust. So I'm going to try to find a Riviera that doesn't have any rust. And this was about 2010. It was kind of the early days of eBay. And of course, I'm shopping on eBay and I'm looking for a car, and this car comes up for sale at a guy in Florida had it. And I reached out to him and he said, Jeff, the car is in beautiful shape. It has 54,000 original miles. It was ordered by the dealership for the dealer's wife, and it has every option on it. So I was thrilled to hear about the car, and it seemed like just like what I wanted, and he promised it had no rust, as any good dealer would. And so I arranged I couldn't travel to Florida at the time, so I arranged with an inspector, a car inspector, to go and evaluate the car for me. And he called me from the phone and said, Jeff, the car is everything that the dealer said it was. It's in beautiful shape. You are going to love that car. So I negotiated with the seller, and we made an agreement to buy the car. And at the end, I had to add one last thing, and that was that if the car arrived and it wasn't quite the way that he described it, I'd like to return it and get a refund. I'll pay the shipping both ways, but I just want to make sure that I'm not stuck with a car that I'm going to have to do more work on than I wanted. So the car, I arranged transportation, and I also had the good sense to have the car registered and insured while it was on its way up from Florida. And the day of arrival is a beautiful Friday, and my wife and daughter are standing next to me, and the car comes in one of those big enclosed car carriers, you know, transport trucks. And the guy, the truck driver, gets out and he opens up all the doors on top. And now I can see the Riviera up at the top, and because it's on the top level, I can see up under the car, and I see rust. And I'm a little disappointed about it, and I pointed out to my wife, and she says, well, maybe it's not that bad. So I reminded her that I had made the arrangement where I could return the car if I didn't like it. So I was a little disgusted, but I had the truck driver just kind of back the car into my garage, and I figured I'd deal with it that night. So we finished dinner, and my wife says, you know, Jeff, you've never even driven the car. Why don't you at least take it for a ride and see how you like it? And I was kind of envisioning that big floaty ride of 60s cars that General Motors had. But boy, I got this car out on the highway, and it was driving really nice. It handled fantastic. It had a lot of power. And I called my wife from the road, and I said, sweetheart, this car drives so nice. I think I'm gonna keep it. I'm gonna fix that rust, and I'm going to enjoy this car. It's just a wonderful car. And not 2 minutes after that, as I pull off the highway, I hit a deer, and not 5 minutes from my house. And through the accident, I wrinkled up the hood and the fender of the car. Well, I wasn't going to return it at that point anyhow, but what a mess I made of the car. So I had never even hit a squirrel. I wasn't sure what to do, and I drove the car home, and my wife says, you got to call the police. So I dial the police department, and a lady dispatcher answers the phone. And I said, I hit a deer on Route 117. And she muffles the phone, and she says, we got the guy on the phone that hit the deer on Route 117. She says to me, do you want the deer? No, I don't want the deer. I guess I had crossed over some law that says if you hit a deer, you can keep the deer. She says, we'll send an officer right over to take a report. And the officer comes over, and he looks at the front of the car, and there's deer fur sticking out, and there was no question that this was the car that was involved in the accident. So he writes a report, and I bring the car to my favorite body shop, and the guy looks it over, and he looks at the car and says, Jeff, this is a beautiful car. I can definitely fix that fender and that hood, but there's no way that we're going to be able to match the paint. You're going to have to paint the whole car. So that's what we ended up doing, and it entailed about a year-long restoration. We ended up taking the engine out, replacing the interior, and you can see the beautiful job that we did on the car. I took a few liberties with customization. I changed the wheels and did a couple of other little things on the car. But my wife has a saying, and she says, no one will ever guess how much dough hitting that dough really cost. This is such a neat car. I want to show you the engine on this car. It's a Buick engine. They call it a nail head, and it's a 425 cubic inch engine. It has 2 carburetors. Remember, this was a fully loaded car. It has air conditioning. It has these great horns. Now, these horns were an option. Let me tell you, when these horns, I'm behind you and I blast these horns, man, you think there's a freight train there. It's that loud. The people at General Motors knew that anybody that is driving this car, and they've got the air conditioning on, and you can see all these hoses, all of the air conditioning controls work with vacuum. And so what would happen is when you stomp on the engine and those 2 carburetors open up, you'll lose all your vacuum. So the good folks at Buick had the idea to put a vacuum reserve tank on, and that would keep the air conditioning running while you're stomping on your 2 4-barrel carburetors. It also has this heavy-duty voltage regulator. It was like a police voltage regulator, completely solid state. And we did a beautiful restoration of the car, have driven it all over the East Coast. It's a really fun car to drive, and it handles beautifully just like it was intended to. So the next car that I'd like to share with you is this 1960 Cadillac Coupe DeVille. And I bought this car as a 50th birthday present for my wife. This Cadillac replaces a Cadillac that I had years ago that I had restored while we were dating, and we actually used it in our wedding. And for some ungodly reason, I sold that Cadillac. And my wife says, "That's the car you never should have sold. I loved that car." So for her 50th birthday, I bought this one. Now, I looked for a long time to try to find a Cadillac that was really, really spectacular, and this one seemed to fit the bill. It has 47,000 original miles on it. It has the original paint. It even has the original exhaust system. It's a very original car. And what's neat about it is that it sat in the dealer showroom from 1960 to 1970. It was in Rickenbaugh Cadillac in Colorado Springs, and the dealer loved this color. It's called Persian sand, and it has a matching Persian sand interior. The color was so unique and so beautiful that he left it for his customers to see for 10 years. And in 1970, some disgruntled customer came along and took a key and walked right up the side of the car, and you can kind of see the scratch that remains. And it's really too bad, but we've done the best we could to try to buff it out. And the rest of the paint is in such beautiful shape that I guess it gives it character. The car was so original when we got it, it still had the window sticker on the back window. I've since removed that window and preserved it, but that's another story. What was cool about the car was that my wife drove it quite regularly when she first got it. And in fact, she used to drive our daughter to school in it. And that's odd because in the line of cars dropping off kids, you have the minivan, you have the occasional BMW, you have a lot of other interesting pedestrian type cars. And then my daughter comes up in this car and the kids are like, "Shana, what was that you got dropped off in? It looks like a spaceship." And of course, I like to joke around and tell the kids, "Don't get too close, you'll cut yourself on those fins." So the car is up on blocks, and you might say, well, he doesn't use the car very much. But in fact, we do. We take it down each spring, and this car will come down any day now, and we'll get to use it again. But the reason it's up on blocks is just to kind of show the long, beautiful lines of the car. To me, this car was prettier than the 59, which, by the way, had the largest fins of any of the Cadillacs. By 60, they had kind of tamed it a little bit, and in my estimation, it's the most beautiful of the Cadillacs. Just a couple of years ago, Rich Lentinello wrote this book, Cadillac Style, and was kind enough to allow our car to grace the cover of the book. The book goes into Cadillacs year by year, but here's a beautiful story on Ginny's Cadillac. And we're obviously very proud of the car, and she gets a lot of use out of it when the weather's good. So the next car that I'd like to show you is this 1965 Pontiac GTO. Having grown up in the 60s and 70s, muscle cars that was it. I mean, we lived and breathed muscle cars. All the cool guys had them, and I always wanted one. And the one that I wanted the most was a 65 GTO. So when I started looking, I found out a couple of things. First off, these cars aren't that easy to find, not in any condition. And of course, I wanted one in really good condition. And so I looked and looked, and the term driven hard and put away wet really applies to these cars. Nobody cared about the cars back in the day. They were raced, they were really driven very, very hard. But this car had an exceptional background. The car was bought new by the Snellgrove Florist family. The founder of Snellgrove Florist in Connecticut bought the car new. It was at the end of the 1965 model year, and he took very good care of the car, drove it sparingly, and then passed it on to his son, who kept it for a number of years and eventually passed it on to his son. The car had never been in an accident, and they retained all of the paperwork with the car, the owner's manual, the warranty book, the original sales invoice. Eventually, the car was bought by Lee Barnes, a well-known GTO restorer. He specializes just in GTO restorations. And he took the car and he wanted to bring it back to factory fresh, brand new day one condition. And he did a phenomenal job. If you look down the sides of this car, the quarter panels, the paint is just phenomenal. What makes the car really interesting is that it has its color is starlight black with a red interior. And the red interior in this car is just scrumptious. I mean, it is so beautiful. I don't know why the combination wasn't more popular, but it's very hard to find a black on red car. And I loved cars with red interiors. And the red stripe just make this car. What you're looking at here is a 1961 Pontiac Ventura Bubbletop. And the reason they call it a Bubbletop, I'll explain in just a minute. But I want you to check out how beautiful this car was. It really struck me. The color is called Rochelle Blue. It has a blue interior. And Pontiac in the 60s, they just had styling down. Look at this grille. It's got what they call a waterfall design. It just kind of flows right down. And of course, all Pontiacs of the era had a split grille, so that's why you see the two sides like that. It was considered a mid-size car in its day. This was before the GTO. And if you look at the wheels are probably the most beautiful wheels that General Motors ever produced. They call these 8 lugs. And the reason why is there's 8 lugs that hold them on to the drums. But the finned part is actually the brake drum. So I guess to help improve the braking, these are drum brakes, they had those fins on there to improve the cooling. And in the process, they just came up with such a gorgeous design. There were several iterations of it right through the 60s, but the 8-lug wheel was an enduring styling treatment that was known only to Pontiacs. It's a funny thing about Pontiacs, but for just a few dollars more than a Chevrolet, they really gave you a little bit extra. And that extra made you feel special when you bought a Pontiac. You weren't just a Chevrolet guy, you were a Pontiac guy. And you were on your way up to an Oldsmobile, a Buick, and maybe someday a Cadillac. Now, the roof line of this car, and this is what you'll notice, this is why they call it the Bubbletop, because look at the glass area on this car. This is what they call the greenhouse, and it's got a lot of greenhouse effect, but this rear window actually had that kind of a bubble shape. I think it was a very beautiful design, very graceful. The Ventura was the medium in the middle of the lineup. So the low-priced Pontiac was the Catalina, then you had the Ventura, and then finally the Bonneville. Now the Bonneville was the most luxurious of the Pontiacs of 1961. And what they did to kind of differentiate the Bonneville was they extended the rear end by 5 or 6 inches, which maybe made the car look a little bit more grand. But to me, they missed the balance of the car between the trunk, the greenhouse, and the hood. This car seems to me to have the right proportions, just a beautifully balanced car. And in the sunlight, this Rochelle blue color is just gorgeous. So I had mentioned that this was a mid-sized car. These Pontiac, the Ventura and the Catalina were very popular race cars, stock car race cars at the time, and they performed very, very well. And the old adage, race on Sunday, sell on Monday, certainly applied to this car. So the next thing I'd like to show you is the HR department. And HR stands for hot rods, and hot rods really deserve their own building. Come on inside, let me show you this. So the reason that we built this building for hot rods is because I recognized, maybe half a dozen years ago, that hot rods are so important to all the cars that came after with hot rods. The muscle cars totally owe their existence, in my opinion, to hot rods. Now, I want to show you the first 32 Ford that we have here in the collection. This was my first hot rod, and really it's the reason that I built this building, because it piqued my interest in what hot rods were all about. Now, this car was built in 1999 in California by an old-time hot rodder who really understood what the classic hot rods were all about. It's what they call a highboy, where the body sits up on top of the chassis, and it has a small block Chevy engine, which was very popular in the 60s for hot rods. The body style is a 32 Ford Roadster, and it's made of fiberglass. It's a Westcott body, and the reason why is because these cars were so popular, most of them got used up in racing, turning them into hot rods. For whatever reason, it was so hard to find any real steel-bodied 32 Fords that existed that a market developed for the fiberglass bodies, and this is one of them. So the engine that's sitting next to this 32 Ford is a 1967 Corvette 327 engine, and this engine actually came out of my silver Corvette when we restored it. It wasn't the original engine, and when we restored the Corvette, we decided to put in an engine that more closely matched the dates. So there's a 66 engine. So I had this engine hanging around, and I thought, you know, why not dress it up like a hot rod engine? Maybe someday it'll wind up in another hot rod, or maybe a 67 Corvette. Here's a real deal 32 Ford. Now, this car came from California. You see the California license plate on there, and it was owned by a guy named Jim Plummer. Jim Plummer bought the car while he was in high school, and he raced it on the salt flats and really used the car all through his high school years. Eventually, he traded it to his friend Paul Beecher, and Paul kept the car for a number of years and then traded it back to Jim Plummer. And the car actually went back and forth a couple of times. When Jim Plummer had the car, he kind of restored it, painted it the way you see it. This paint's been on the car a long time. And when he passed away, he left the car to his daughter, and his daughter kept the car a number of years. Great memory of her dad. And then when she wanted to get rid of the car, she called Paul Beecher, and Paul Beecher's son picked up the car, and he had it for a number of years. So the car has been very closely held for a long time. And that's very typical of these cars. They really weren't, they were cherished, and they were held very closely. Now, what is interesting about this car is, if you look over here, it's got this tag on the dash, and you can see that the car raced at Bonneville on August 25th, 1950, and it reached a speed of 123 miles an hour. 123 miles an hour in one of these is you're holding on, let me tell you. It's got skinny bias ply tires and an old braking system. It's a flathead Ford. The whole car is shaking at that speed, but that's the speed that Jim Plummer achieved with this car and proudly displays with his dash plaque. So you might say, Jeff, why do you have so many 32 Ford Roadsters? Well, the reason is, when I bought this car, I really wasn't intending to buy it. I really wanted to buy that car, the next car I'm going to talk about. That was a very difficult car to acquire. And let me tell you the story about this car for a minute. This is another 32 Ford Roadster, a real steel car. And this car was really the car I searched and tried to buy for about 2 years. It was owned by a gentleman named Bernie Couch. Now, when Bernie was 16 years old, he had saved up enough money from his paper route to buy this car. It cost $285, and here's Bernie as a 16-year-old with his new purchase. And he was very popular with the ladies. These are some of his girlfriends at the time. Well, right as the war started, Bernie signed up for the Navy, and while he was away, he wrote to his dad and said, "Dad, send me a picture of my dog and my Roadster." Well, Bernie's dad sent him this picture here with him in there too. After the war, everybody was going racing, and Bernie, he took off the fenders of his car and he went racing too, and the place to race was the Salt Flats of Utah, and El Mirage and Bonneville. That's where racing took place, and Bernie was part of it. He went 134 miles an hour in this car. This picture was from the February 1952 Hot Rod magazine cover, and this is just another shot of his car ready to race without the fenders. Late in 1952, Bernie stopped racing. He joined up with his brother in the printing business and kind of returned his Roadster to the street. And here it is here in street form. He kept his hopped up engine with the 2 carburetors and the Evans heads, and eventually returned the fenders to the car and drove it in the early 50s until he parked it in his garage and raised his family, and it sat there until the 1980s when he decided to take the car out and restore it and start driving it again. He had retired from the printing business, and he got the car back on the road and drove it for about 30 years until his early 90s when we really couldn't drive anymore. And that's when I came on the scene, and it turns out it wasn't just me, but a lot of people wanted to buy this car from Bernie. Bernie wasn't about to sell it to just anybody, though, and he checked me out for probably as long as I checked him out, and we asked each other questions. He was concerned about what kind of buyer I might be, and I was really concerned if he was really going to be a seller. So after several conversations, I was able to convince him that I wouldn't alter the car. I wouldn't turn it into a street rod. I'd keep the legacy of Bernie Couch with his car. And I think I've done that. I had the opportunity just before Bernie passed away to bring the car to the Grand National Roadster Show. And Bernie and I talked about bringing his car to the Grand National Roadster Show, bringing it back to California so his friends and family could see the car one last time and Bernie could be there. Unfortunately, he passed away just before the show, but I was able to bring the car out there, and I think everyone agreed that I had done the right thing by the car, keeping it kind of original, kind of the way that Bernie had it. My goal was to bring it right back to that 1952 era. So over a couple of years of negotiating with Bernie to buy this car, I got to the point where I thought, he's never going to sell me the car. So I kept looking at 32 Ford Roadsters, and lo and behold, this one came about with a wonderful close family ownership, a real Henry Ford steel-bodied 32, and I ended up buying this car, and not a month later, I get a phone call from Bernie, "Jeff, I'm ready to sell the car." So what could I do? I had to buy them both. So this is a 1936 Ford Roadster, and I really wasn't looking for a 36 Ford Roadster when the car came into my possession. And I'd like to tell you this story. It's kind of cute. I was at the big Hershey swap meet in Pennsylvania, and I'm walking up and down the rows, and they have tents, and in the tents are cars for sale, and this car was there under one of the tents, and the hood was open, and it kind of caught my eye because it looked like a nice, unrestored, original 36 Ford Roadster. And Roadsters were a pretty rare body style to begin with. I mean, if you had the money for a Roadster in the mid-30s during the Depression, you must have been well off. Why was the Roadster so rare and unusual? Well, it has no roll-up windows on the side. This was like the sports car of the day. It's a two-seater. If you bought one of these, this was a real sporting car. So I see the car at Hershey, and I liked the condition, and the hood was open, and I walked over to it, and I took about 2 loops around, And I thought to myself, you know, there was a price on the windshield. It didn't seem bad. Maybe that's a car I'd consider. And I walked down 2 more booths, and I see a guy I know from Rhode Island. And I said to him, hey, Peter, did you see that 36 Ford up the road? A lot of guys would do that as they're walking around telling their buddy, did you see this? Did you see that? And so he said, I sure did, Jeff. And do you know whose car that is or was? I said, no, Peter, no idea whose car it was. He says, that was Gil Stafford's car. Did you know Gil Stafford? Now, in Rhode Island, every car guy knows the other car guy. We're a small state, and it's a pretty tight networked community. In fact, I said, yes, Peter, I did know Gil Stafford very well. And he was my teacher the first year in college. He taught a class in machine design, and at the beginning of the class, he said, everybody stand up, tell me a little about yourself, where you're from, what you like to do. And we all did that. And then he stood up and said, my name is Gil Stafford, and I'm going to be a machine design professor, and I like to collect antique cars. Well, I was 19 years old. I loved cars. I didn't know anything about antique cars, but he said that, whoop, my ears perked up, and I said, I got to talk to him. And after the class, I said, Mr. Stafford, I'm Jeff Goldstein, and I'm in your class here, and I love antique cars. He said to me, you know, Jeff, would you like to see my antique car collection? Now, today, that would be a weird question for a teacher to ask, but back then, it wasn't so much so, and I was so enthused. I said, yes, Mr. Stafford, I'd love to. He gave me the directions to his house, and we met on a Saturday, and I know I'm off the track here a little bit, but bear with me. He lives on a farm, and in the back is one of these dairy barns, a long dairy barn, and in the dairy barn, he has every car that he ever bought from new, beginning with a 32 Ford, 36 Ford, 39 Ford, 42 Ford, all lined up. He always bought Fords, never traded them in, never sold them, just kept the car. And so he's showing me this line of cars, and they're all beautiful, and I get right to the end, and there's a 55 Thunderbird, a Coral 55 Thunderbird, and that was really the only car I could associate with, because the other cars, they just look like old cars, antiques. So I said, Mr. Stafford, all these cars are beautiful, but the one I really like is that 55 T-Bird at the end. And he said, Jeff, come over here, I want to show you something. And he walked over to this 36 Ford, and he opens the hood like this. And I'm going to show you something. He says, do you see that? Do you see that right there? And he's pointing to this chrome thing on the top of the engine, a very shiny thing. I don't really know what it is. He says, do you know what that is? I said, no, Mr. Stafford, I have no idea what that is. And he says, that's a supercharger. And I installed that in 1937. It increases the horsepower from 85 to 125. I said, wow, Mr. Stafford, that's a very impressive supercharger. I really didn't know what else to say. But me, in my 19-year-old mind, I'm standing in front of the car, and I'm looking down at his license plate. Now, the license plate that he had on the car was license plate number S100. And I thought, that's a cool-looking license plate. Coming from Rhode Island, we love our license plates, and I liked that one. I said, you know, Mr. Stafford, this is a really cool car, but I really like your license plate. If you ever want to get rid of it, I'd like to have it. Oh my God, Mr. Stafford, I could tell his face turned color right away. He says, Chef, that license plate, I could never get rid of it. First off, the governor gave me that license plate. And secondly, that license plate begins with S. You need a license plate that begins with G. I said, oh, I guess you're right, Mr. Stafford. And you know, I forgot about everything that happened that day. It all came rushing back at that very moment as I'm looking at this car with a supercharger on it in Hershey. And so I walk around the car. Now I'm thinking maybe I could buy this car. And I'm looking underneath it, and I'm looking under the seats, and I reach into the glove compartment. And in the glove compartment, there's some old Band-Aids and a whole bunch of keys and a screwdriver. And I pick up the keychain, and on the keychain is a little tag. It's called a DAV tag. Disabled American Veterans would send you these little tags with a miniature license plate, just like your license plate. And this one said S100. So it kind of sealed the deal for me. I knew this really was Gil Stafford's car. The price wasn't bad. It really didn't look bad. I decided I had to have this car. And so that's how I ended up buying the car. And I broke all my rules of car buying. I never drove the car, never even heard it run. I negotiated and bought the car. And the guy that was selling it was nice enough. He says, well, I live in Connecticut. I'll deliver it for you. And he backed it right into my, my garage. And I remember the first day. Now, I never had an early Ford like this. This was the first flathead-powered car that I bought. I bought this before I bought the 32 Fords. And I'm looking down into the engine compartment, and I see a couple of wires down there, and they look like they're disconnected. So I pick them up, and I want to plug them back in, and as soon as I touched them, they fell apart like old brittle newspaper. Just, there was nothing to it. So I realized at that point I was probably going to have to rewire the car. And after rewiring it, and then rebuilding the engine, and then rebuilding the transmission, and replacing the interior, and a bunch of other stuff, I managed to get the car so it's drivable and safe. And here you see it, just the way I bought it. I think this is the same paint that was on the car when Gil Stafford had it, and it was his pride and joy. I'm thrilled to have it. So next to Gil Stafford's car, we have this engine display. This is a flathead Ford. This has the same supercharger on it that Gil's car had, but you can really see the supercharger here and how it operated with the belts. It was built by McCulloch. This was one of the first McCulloch products. Now that's the same company that makes the chainsaws and Paxton superchargers later on. McCulloch was the guy that invented this product and sold it very successfully. And the other thing that's neat about this engine are these heads. Now, if you look over here, these heads are made by Federal Mogul, and they're made of copper. They're 100% copper, and there's no internal cooling. All the cooling is done externally through this tube right here. And I guess they felt the fins and the copper were enough to extract the heat from the engine. It's a very rare set of cylinder heads, and it's maybe someday I'll get the nerve to actually put them on a running engine and see how they go. So the next car that we're going to talk about is this 34 Ford three-window coupe. It's the only coupe in the collection. And the reason that they call it three-window is because they don't include the windshield. It's got a window here, a window in the back, window on the other side, and it's a very beautiful body style. The car came from a friend of mine who bought it when he was 16 years old in 1958. That fellow, Norman, had kept the car all through high school, and he had restored the car back pretty much to a stock 34 Ford. And the first time I saw the car was at a car show, and I said to Norman, you know, Norm, your car is so beautiful. If you ever want to sell it, I might be interested. I'd like to buy it. And he said to me, Jeff, I'll keep that in mind. And I thought I'd never hear from him again. But a year later, I ran into him at another car show, and he said, you know, Jeff, I think, you know, if you're still interested, I'm getting ready to sell the car. Well, at that time, I hadn't built the HR department and really didn't have room for it. So I said, Norm, I'm building a new garage. It may take a year, but I'd be interested in the car then. And he said, well, that's fine, Jeff. I'm really in no hurry. So another year went by, and I was able to buy the car from Norm. And what he had were some photographs, some very old photographs of the car. And I'll show you one of those photographs a little later on. But it showed the car in 1956 when he was still in high school. And it didn't have the big spare tire on the back. And it had these Olds Fiesta wheel covers, which were very popular in the day, and the big white wall tires, dual exhaust, and of course a hopped up 59 AB engine and a 39 transmission, which was the hot combination back in the day. And so looking at the photograph, I said, Norm, this is the way that I'd like the car to be, just like it was when you had it in high school. He says, Jeff, if you buy the car, you can do with it whatever you like. So within short order, I managed to find a set of Olds Fiesta wheel covers and put the wide white walls back on the car. And here it is, and when I show you the photograph, you'll see that we very closely replicated the way this car looked when Norm was still in high school. Now, one other feature that I want to show you about the 34 Ford three-window coupes are the way the door and window works. It's what you call a suicide door, so it opens up like this. And then if you come around the side here, watch the way this window rolls up. It rolls up like a normal window, but watch what happens when it gets to the end. Look at this. It kind of slides back. It's like a little vent window. That was the smoker's window. And I think 34 was the only year that had it just like that. What a neat idea that Ford had, you know? So what we've got here is a 1933 Ford Roadster, and I bought this car a few years ago at an auction in Scottsdale. To me, this was the most beautiful hot rod I've ever seen. It's probably the finest restoration in this garage. And at the time that I saw it, of course, it caught me because it was so beautiful, but also because it had an outstanding history. And I started to recognize that it's not enough to just buy an old car, but it's so much more fun if you can buy an old car that has a great history, and this one does. This car was bought new by a guy named Harry Warner. And Harry Warner lived in Chicago. So shortly after he drove out to California, he got a job at Lockheed, and he was building aircraft parts, and he met a new friend, Wayne Horning. And Wayne and Harry got swept up in the hot rodding movement of the late 40s and early 50s. And what they decided to do was to build speed parts for six-cylinder Chevrolets. And this car became the test bed for their new enterprise called Wayne Manufacturing. And the engine that they built is one on display right over here. And it's what they call a 12-port. Now, a 12-port refers to the cylinder head, where the Chevrolet six-cylinder was a very, very good engine, but it had a breathing problem in that the intake and exhaust ports were Siamese. So there were two ports, two cylinders for each port, and they couldn't get enough air and fuel in and exhaust out. So what Harry and Wayne did was they cast their own cylinder head, their own intake manifold, so that they could put the intake manifold on one side and have a port for each cylinder, and the exhaust on the other side with another port for each cylinder. This vastly improved the performance of the six-cylinder Chevy and made it competitive with the flathead Ford V8. So this engine was in Harry Warner's car, and it was used for many years to test out their speed equipment company parts. So this poster kind of shows some of the stuff that Wayne Manufacturing was all about. And here's Harry Warner right here working on one of his cylinder heads. This kind of tells the whole story of Wayne Manufacturing. They even entered a car in the Indianapolis 500. Here's another shot of Harry Warner. I think he's working on this very 33 Ford. In March of 1953, Hop Up magazine, which was one of the leading hot rod magazines of the day, did an article on the car, and they called it a Chev-Ford combination. And here's Harry right here with his car at Pomona, trying out some of his new speed equipment parts. Now this picture right here under my thumb shows a picture of Harry's car, and you can see the dashboard, and that dashboard is right up there on the shelf. It's the very dashboard that Harry used. And we had an occasion where his son Dan came to visit. He wanted to see his dad's old car, and Dan said to me, "Yeah, that was my dad's old dashboard. I'll show you what was the most important feature of that whole dashboard for my dad." He had a lot of switches on there and gauges. He had 2 gas tanks, and he could switch gas tanks back and forth. But this one right here, this is his cigar lighter. Dad always smoked a cigar, and that to him was a big deal. So Harry Warner kept this car his whole life, and when he passed away, there were a lot of people that wanted to buy the car, but Bill Swanson, a neighbor, he was successful in buying it from the Warner family. He had a wonderful plan to restore the car, and he did a real top-notch restoration on it. You can see the car is absolutely gorgeous, and it didn't lead an easy life either. Bill had his work cut out for him in restoring the car, but when it came to the engine, that's when Bill was faced with a little bit of a quandary. Should he put the 6-cylinder Chevy engine back in the way Harry had it, or should he do something else? And what he decided was to return a flathead to the car, but not any ordinary flathead, an Arden-headed car. So the Arden is a very interesting overhead valve conversion that increased the horsepower of this car to almost 160 horsepower by the nature of its cylinder design. Very similar to a hemispherical or a Hemi engine. This had overhead valves, and it was built and marketed by the Duntoff brothers, Zora and Yuri. Now those two brothers worked together out of New York to come up with speed equipment to increase the performance of flathead Fords. And the Arden is a part of their name. Arkus Duntov is what that stands for. So Zora Arkus Duntov is sometimes called the godfather of the Corvette, because immediately after his enterprise with Arden, he got a job working for Chevrolet, and his first assignment was the V8 Corvette. And what he's synonymous, all Corvette guys know who Zora Duntov is, but very few guys know that his first enterprise were these cylinder heads for flathead Fords. Now, hot rodders love these cylinder heads. Not only are they attractive, but they really do increase the performance of the flathead, and they look cool as hell.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure and hit the like button and subscribe.